The chat says we're good. Is everybody? There it is. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. My name is Chris Smith, and I am your host for the program every Wednesday at noon. It's good to be with you. I'm glad that you can all hear me now. Thank you, everybody, for jumping into the chat and letting us know what was going on. Whether you're watching on YouTube or also my team behind the scenes here on the Zoom call. Thank you so much. We've got a great show for you today. From the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education, Museum of Natural Sciences, and co-sponsored by the Department of Environmental Quality's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion and the LGBT Center of Raleigh. Today, we've got a great show for you. We're going to be hearing from 5 special guests, special voices, to bring us today's LGBTQ plus leaders in STEM panel discussion. Let's jump right into it, shall we? Let me introduce today's very special guests. First off, everybody, I want you to meet Ray Allen. Ray is a PhD candidate at Duke University, studying sea urchins and indigenous technology. Ray, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Next up, everybody say hi to Scott LaGreca. Scott is a collections manager for Lichens at Duke University. And you know, being a museum person, I love a collection. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Happy Pride.
Next up, everybody, meet environmental scientist Ellie Cardenal. Ellie works in stormwater and regulatory compliance for an international science firm. Hi, Ellie.
Hey, everybody. So happy to be here.
Thanks so much. And then Dr. Chris Martens. Dr. Martens is a computer scientist at North Carolina State University, running a lab that works on something pretty cool, video games. Dr. Martens, welcome.
Thanks so much, Chris. Happy to be here.
And then, certainly not least, but at least last on my list in this case, is Anita Simha. Anita is a community ecologist, also at Duke University, and a PhD candidate. Anita, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride indeed. Thanks to all 5 of you for agreeing to be a part of today's conversation and to chat with us, take some of our questions, and taking questions from the audience. Since I guess folks couldn't hear me, I'll remind you all, although it looks like plenty of folks learned how to use the chat when you couldn't hear me, leave your questions and thoughts there as we go. Late in the program, we'll be turning to your voices and getting your thoughts and sharing your questions with today's panel. So to get started, I have the first question that I'll pose to each one of you in turn, which is to give us a little bit of an introduction to each of you and a little bit of an introduction to your science and the work that you're involved in. Ray, can you get us started?
Sure. So bonjour, everybody. So hi, I'm Ray. And kind of like the history and like my career path so far started kind of like where I grew up. So I'm a member of the Lac du Flambeau Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians in what is currently called Wisconsin. And so I grew up there, spent a lot of time doing different cultural practices like fishing and spearing and working with like the non-human relatives that live around us. And so that's had a huge impact on kind of like my focus on science in high school. And then like when I went to undergraduate, I majored in chemistry, biology, and got introduction to developmental biology. I was able to work in some labs on C. elegans, so like the little worms, and then also zebrafish as well, since there's a special place in my heart for aquatic creatures. From there, I applied and went to I'm currently in graduate school at Duke University, where I'm a member of the McClay Lab and where we do work on sea urchins. So for those who don't know what a sea urchin is, like sea urchins are like these like spiny creatures that like live in the ocean and walk around on the ocean floor. And this is a Pokemon called Pincurchin that's inspired off of sea urchins. So representation of my model organism. And from there, I'm kind of hoping to do a little bit more academic work, but also have a major interest in science policy and science communication. So.
Thank you very much. Scott, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work at Duke University.
Yeah, well, I'm from upstate New York originally, like about half the people in the state, it seems. And I got interested in biology, like we moved to the countryside when I was a teenager. My grandparents gave me a wildflower book. And so I would be hiking around and trying to identify all the plants. And eventually it just occurred to me, all these things have names and I wanted to know what they are. And I went to school for botany at Cornell University, which is also upstate New York. And I took courses on all the different organisms I could, and eventually just found the most obscure group of organisms, which are lichens, which are fungi which grow with a photosynthetic organism like a green alga or a cyanobacterium, photosynthetic bacterium. And I'm interested in the systematics and evolution of lichen-forming fungi. And so that would be like describing new species, looking at DNA sequences to sort out like the tree of relationships, to the phylogeny, the tree of life for these lichen-forming fungi. And yeah, my work involves like doing big species inventories of different places. I've got a project going, Lichens of Bermuda, and it's just all about kind of, describing biodiversity, describing new species new to science. And my role at Duke University, so actually after Cornell, went to Duke and got my PhD in botany in the same department that I'm actually in now. So 20 years after I got my PhD at Duke, I returned, which was 2017, and I'm the collections manager for lichens for the herbarium. And an herbarium is a big collection of pressed specimen vouchers. And so we've got like 170 or more, 170,000 specimens, which I'm in charge of. And I know at the museum, you guys are all about specimens, and I've worked at different museums myself. And yeah, so I guess I just have this unique perspective of Duke and North Carolina, having been here in the 90s and then come back like 20 years later.
Yeah, I think a few things have changed since then. Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like
Thanks,
I'm in a time warp sometimes. Yeah.
All right. Moving right along then. Ellie, can you share with us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my path to science is not super traditional. I don't think I really gave too much into science like growing up. I sort of realized suddenly after 2 years into a speech pathology program that I wasn't being challenged and my sort of needs weren't being met. And I realized that for a few of us, you can have fulfillment and also feed and clothe yourself. My background is in geology. I have an undergraduate in geology as well as a master's degree. At NC State, I studied big picture, sort of how landscapes change over time and the human influence on that, and looked at how vegetation environments are resilient or not resilient over time, in terms of land development and lots of disturbances and stuff. So it's really interesting to be able to take that perspective that geologists have, over like billions and billions of years, which is hard for lots of people to sort of conceptualize, and look at resiliency in terms of water, stormwater, wastewater, and how climate is going to be impacting all of our infrastructure. And so today, I've only been in industry a year. I graduated in July of 2020. So thanks so much for calling me a leader, but I don't think I'm quite there yet. But yeah, it's been great to sort of look at all the funding and the shift sort of that we're seeing to the importance of climate and resilience in terms of all of our infrastructure. And I do a lot of that work for federal clients, DoD, things like that. So that's where I'm at.
Okay, very interesting stuff. Yes, we'll definitely give you the leadership title. That's congratulations on graduating too, since that was fairly recent.
Thank you so much.
All right, next up, everybody, let's hear from Dr. Chris Martens, because I want to know a little bit more about this video game science.
Hello, yes, thank you. So I'm Chris Martens. I am an assistant professor at NC State in the computer science department. My background is computer science, and my training is computer science, but digital games as a field tends to span, the computational and the worlds of art and design. So that's kind of an intersection where I'm most comfortable. A lot of my research has to do with computational creativity, sort of computer models of how people might think when interacting with like a game, or when creating some, when coming up with creative ideas. In that sense, it also sort of fits into the general field of human computer interaction, because I study not just computers, but the humans who are interacting with them. But I also study like technologies for creating and reasoning about virtual worlds, including games and interactive storytelling systems.
And
Yeah.
tell us all the name of the lab that you run, because it's got a great acronym as well.
Yeah, so I direct the POEM lab at NC State, POEM. It stands for Principles of Expressive Machines.
I love that you work in like narrative storytelling in digital environments, and the lab is called POEM.
We name all of our projects after types of poems. Like Villanelle is the name of one of our projects, for example. So.
Oh, how cool is that? Thanks for sharing. And then Anita, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a community ecologist, also a PhD candidate at Duke University. And that means that I study how different species of plants interact with each other in a community. I'm particularly interested in how kind of the history of how a community came together or assembled can affect the way that present interactions take place. As part of my PhD, I'm also pursuing a certificate in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. And through that work, I'm also considering how the history of the field of ecology itself influences how ecologists think about ecological problems today. So there's a lot of kind of metaphors and parallels in the work that I do. And just to give a little bit of history about myself, I grew up in this area. If I had to trace back the moment I became a biologist, I'd probably locate that moment in Hemlock Bluffs Nature Preserve in Cary. I went to UNC Chapel Hill for my undergrad, so although I'm at Duke now, I do claim to be a Tar Heel. And yeah, I've just been bouncing around the triangle my whole life.
Oh, fascinating. So still light blue instead of dark blue, but that's okay. That's okay. Well, I was looking at the lineup. I was like, oh, we have lots of folks at Duke University. I have a degree from Duke University as well. So like, there's just a lot of dark blue hanging out. Museum uses dark blue on this. Anyway, well, it's great to meet all of you and hear a little bit about the work that you do, the science that you're interested and involved in. But of course, for today's panel, we also wanted to raise visibility and dive into sort of what it means to identify as LGBTQ plus within the STEM community, or how these communities engage and interact with one another. So I think if y'all are ready, we can dive into some of those questions a little bit. Y'all did a great job with your introductions and getting us into the science as well. Although I do want to know all about all of your science. Like, we're gonna have to invite all 5 of you back for future presentations just to hear about like digital learning systems and lichens and sea urchins and all of these great things. So first question then is, how have you engaged and learned from your community throughout your education and into your career paths? And Anita, you were actually just talking about some of the intersections between the science, community ecology, and these gender and sexuality studies that you're also interested in. So could you lead off on this question for us?
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, community is everything. I do a lot of field work where we go out into kind of natural communities of plants and study them at those field sites. And I've done that in more remote parts of the Rockies. I've done that kind of at a drive-up field site right here in Duke Forest. But what I found through all of those experiences is that a lot of times there are things that we figure out as a team that I would not have been able to figure out alone. And to me, not to turn everything into a metaphor, but to me, that really parallels the ecological phenomenon of emergence, where when you study things at bigger and bigger scales, patterns emerge that you wouldn't have been able to see at the smaller scale. So an example of that is that if you look at a whole brain, the human brain is conscious. But if you just study individual neurons, then you would miss consciousness, because that's a phenomenon that only emerges at the level of the brain. And in the same way, when I study whole communities of lots of different species of plants, I end up seeing patterns that I would have missed if I'd only been looking at a particular species at a time. And at the same time, when I'm studying all of those things with a team, we end up figuring things out that I wouldn't have been able to figure out alone. So to me, all of the best science is done collaboratively in teams.
It makes a lot of sense to me. That's excellent. Although that what you're just saying, Anita, resonated with something that Ellie was talking about too, which is finding fulfillment in the sciences or in pursuing science. So I'm wondering, Ellie, what your perception of like finding that sweet spot in science is, and then finding the intersection with your identity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, big disclaimer I always say to people is like, sometimes you're just gonna have a job, you know what I mean? We have to feed ourselves, we have to, you know, house ourselves and everything. I think finding like a perfect job that gives you every single thing you want is a really big task a lot of the time. And so I think particularly that's why having a community either within or without of work is really, really important. I am in a different sort of work situation. So I am actually on site at a military installation. I am on site support. So I'm in the client's office. I don't have the benefit that Anita does of being in this collaborative space with lots of other scientists. I'm the scientist giving the client what they want and interpreting their language and everything to sort of like give them the support and the deliverables that they need. So I'm coming in sort of from the opposite perspective of lacking that and not having that and not being able to necessarily benefit from that. I'm obviously grateful to have a job, but just being very real in my state of things. You know, I work with a lot of people of older generations, particularly the boomer generation. I don't know if that's like okay to say, whatever. And particularly a lot of straight white cisgendered men. And that's part of the reason why I'm in my vehicle, not the men in particular, but just the fact that I work on a military installation. I am, you know, it is a thing, me being at work every day and existing in this space that is difficult at times. And so it's been an interesting year to be able to try to find projects and things that can sort of take me out of like the external environment that I'm in. That's, you know, that's currently where I'm coming from with it.
Ellie, thank you for sharing. Thanks again for being here with us. let's see, Ray, thoughts?
Yeah, community is actually something I think about a lot. And I think when I gave my introduction, I mentioned like how like my cultural / citizen background of being like an Indigenous person. And I think that has been like one of the most prominent things in my life, because a lot of the things that I do and the work that I do, the questions I ask and the work that I hope to publish or the jobs I want to have in the future really revolve around like that community and like neighboring Indigenous communities, because it's something that goes against kind of the US idealism or the idea of like individualism. And instead of like working just so I can benefit myself at the expense of other people, the work that I do is actually like in conjunction with or working alongside like my Indigenous communities. And it's influenced like the way that I think about things in my research and in the way that like I've gone about learning in undergraduate and graduate school. And kind of like one of the communities that I became a part of more recently is like the queer community. So kind of like blending these two worlds has been very interesting to me, because the queer community has been very different, because you kind of come into it and people actually don't talk about it as much and bring it up like the way that I bring about my Indigenous identity. And so that has also been very influential in the way that I think about things and kind of integrating it into like the science and then the work that I do through science and technology studies, which is kind of taking a different approach to stuff. So there's Indigenous science and technology studies, feminist, and then queer studies as well. So it's all connected. It's all about kinship in my mind.
Well, I love the way that everybody on the call just was just nodding along with that. I think that that idea really resonated with everybody here. Dr. Martens, I saw you nodding along, so maybe you can give us some of your perception and insight on that too.
Yeah, I really like hearing from everyone who's spoken so far. It's I feel in some ways that I'm still in the process of kind of learning how potentially like what I do professionally kind of relates to my identity and relates to kind of other aspects of identity that I find important. I know I like just on kind of like a personal interest level, I've done a lot of reading like about ecology and Indigenous approaches to that. Like Braiding Sweetgrass is one of my favorite books, and Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown touches on a lot of the ways that like these sort of scientific metaphors specifically relating to emergence, as Anita brought up, kind of inform the way that communities are created and like how people are, and how those communities can be functional or dysfunctional. And kind of what like thinking of it at that level and kind of as a scientific organism has been really interesting to me as I sort of navigate my professional life. But like, yeah, I think in terms of kind of how it intersects with my own identity and queerness and like computer science, I think like a lot of where I see that coming up is just in how I pretty much grew up with the internet. I had the internet since I was 9 or 10, and it has been pretty much for most of my life like the main place where I find queer community. I've been, I've identified as queer for like much longer than I've identified as a computer scientist, and like the internet has definitely helped me find my people in times when like mostly white small town in Indiana was not helping me find my people. And so that's definitely been reflected as well in like the sort of fantasy worlds that people create through video games, and how people then like talk about those games and do sort of like critical media analysis of queer identity in games. All of this stuff happens on the internet, right? It's like it has been for more than a decade and it still is. And so I'm really fascinated by just like how, kind of both how technology enables this kind of community to form, but then also how sometimes community is like is in an adverse relationship to that, or might profit from that kind of community activity without necessarily like compensating the people who are doing most of the labor for it. So yeah, that's kind of, those are some of my thoughts about this.
Ray, I saw you nodding along. I don't know if you wanted to jump in with a thought on that one or not. And then Scott, I want to come to you.
I think Chris did like an excellent job of describing it. And it's something I think about all the time of how like the individual, that's like where we see individual and capitalism intersecting, where oh, I'm gonna like Chris brought up braiding sweetgrass and like using traditional ecological knowledge, and how Western science is currently trying to like, oh, like let's learn this so we can like be like multicultural and integrated it in, but it's at like the expense of indigenous peoples and like their cultures and their appropriations that like they barely benefit off of it, if anything. So I'm just like, yes, 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 yes. Speak the truth.
I want to jump in on that. I struggle a lot with that because I work at a firm that has like 50,000 employees that definitely benefits from I mean, we have CEOs that are making millions off of, yes, environmental work, but it's like, yeah, environmental work. Like I have a hard time feeling good about what I do sometimes because I mean, and it's just getting into the conversation of we exist within capitalism. We can't like separate ourselves from it. And you know what I mean? I don't know. I got into environmental work because like, you know, I want to do a good thing and I want to like help and preserve and conserve. And it's hard when everything has to be a product and everything has to be worth something, and working for a company that is hugely benefiting off of those things. Just a thought. Yeah.
No, yeah. I mean, it raises a lot of questions about, I guess, like what it would mean to have identities that are not considered, that are not heteronormative identities, but also engaging in all of these spaces where there's overt capitalism and individualism, and how in these spaces sometimes finding your people or finding community in STEM or in an identity is going to be difficult because just the systems were not built to meet the needs of the diversity of humans that actually exist, right? And maybe that's not putting it in the best way, but maybe that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Scott, you were talking earlier in your introduction about sort of moving through these spaces over time and in geography. I read in your bio that you have done work in museums all over the place. So a lot in the Natural History Museum in London, even. So I'm curious to get your thoughts too, since you indicated these sort of changes over time and place.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I'm considerably older than the other people on the panel. I'll just leave it at that. So I do have that perspective. But yeah, no, I started out speaking of community, like my communities were very separate, like as an undergraduate, you know. I came out in the late 80s, so you really had to be more kind of judicious about who you came out to back then. And so I had my friends at school, but then I had like the gay community, the queer community outside of that, and they were very separate for me. And it's very interesting because like, I think back then, like it was an advantage actually, because I would meet, in order to meet other gay guys and queer people, I would go off campus. The bars were like community centers, basically. And at Cornell, like I got to meet like the other people in the community at Ithaca College. And I think that was a different experience for my straight peers, because I don't think they got off campus as much, but because I was seeking out my people, my community, I got to meet a whole range of people at different colleges and in the town itself. And everyone, actually, I applied to graduate school at Duke, and this was like this was 30 years ago, okay? And like Jesse Helms was in power, like notorious misogynist, racist, homophobe, you know. And people were like, don't do it, don't go to Duke, you know, and I did. Me and my boyfriend moved down here. And again, yeah, I kept my community of gay friends, of queer people, like separate from that. And then, but you know, it's always been very important to me. I've been doing like community building, mostly, you know, just attending protests and marches, but also organizing social events, camping trips and that sort of thing, for other gay men. So I've had that experience. But yeah, then moving back here, 20 years after, 20 years later, things had changed a lot. Like between, I think, just probably because of social media, like in the past 10 to 15 years, it's like queer people have become a lot more accepted, and you don't have to be as careful, you know, about who you come out to. And so yeah, my communities now, and I'm in a very inclusive place. My department's more inclusive, my lab's inclusive, and so I don't have that separation as much anymore. It's like I think of well, my dad's cousin was director of the Human Rights Campaign actually in the 90s, so he was a big support for me, just up in DC, right, like 4 hours away. But he put it to me a couple years ago, like we've gone from being outlaws to in-laws, you know, we've suddenly had all this acceptance. So yeah, North Carolina is a much better place community-wise than it was for me. And I think if you want to talk about intersection of identities, I was sort of thinking about this before today. And I think just being a minority, you know, whether it's gender or racial or sexual orientation or whatever, if you're kind of coming from that perspective, you're used to sort of being on the outside. And I think it kind of, you come at science or whatever with a thinking outside the box approach. One example I have is my therapist, that I saw a therapist in grad school. Like I would recommend all graduate students do. I actually ran into him at Whole Foods, which was interesting, in Durham. He's still around, but back in the day, you know, he told me, like, because he's gay too, and he was like, you know, he said it gives me a different perspective. He said, like, because counseling heterosexual couples, he's like, sometimes they would be in very rigid places in terms of gender role, and he, as a gay man thinking outside of all that, he's like, well, hey, why don't you do this to the wife, and like then you do, you know, you do these and switch it up a bit. So I think that's like an example of how our identities can give us a fresh perspective, you know. I can't think of an example from botany, but
well, you bring up a great point too, which is that, I mean, at least in our society in general, but also within STEM, for so long, hetero has been the norm. And so how do you feel like each of you have found a way to challenge heteronormative standards within academia or within you know, within school or even within your careers? I'm not sure who to throw this one to first. Ellie, it looks like I saw you
I'll go.
unmute your mic, so let's hear from you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think by us existing, we challenge it. Do you know what I mean? Like I think a lot of times queer people are given this sort of like voluntold torch of like, you need to pave the way and do all these things. And, you know, definitely praise be to those who do that. But me existing every single day challenges the heteronormativity like standards. I am queer and I'm a I'm apart from that. I think, you know, my very existence is what challenges that.
Thank you. Anita?
Yeah, I'd love to hop in. I definitely agree with Ellie. And I think it's not just that we are here, it's also that because of who we are, us being here, we're doing it differently. Like when I think about what we were talking about earlier with heteronormativity, and that being kind of like boxes that we can fit into, how that works, or I think translates into academia, is through legibility. It's like, I see what you're doing and I understand it, and so it's good and I approve, kind of thing. And I think queer folks are doing something that's a little less legible for the cis het folks in our lives. And that's not just in like a personal life way that's separate from work, but because we are stepping into our work as whole people, that comes in. And, you know, I see that in my own life because I'm not only, you know, an ecologist, and also on the side, I moonlight as a queer person. Actually, through my program, I'm trying to think about what the insights of feminist studies and queer studies are that I can hold centrally with ecology. And I wanted to throw out just another example of how queer studies can bring insights to ecology and biology. There's this paper that I love that was published in 2019, Monk et al. I want to say the title is something like The Evolution of Same-Sex Sexual, or an Alternative Hypothesis for the Evolution of Same-Sex Sexual Behavior. And the premise of the paper is, you know, obviously same-sex sexual behavior has been documented across the tree of life. And we've tried to explain it in each case that it's shown up because it doesn't make sense, evolutionary sense, for same-sex sexual behavior to occur, because you don't get any kind of fitness advantage by doing it. So why would some frogs do it and also some ducks do it? Like, we better figure it out in each case. The alternative hypothesis is, what if it's just the ancestral state? Like, maybe it just is evolutionarily, like from the basis of life, just something that happened. That's a way simpler explanation. Parsimony is kind of like the key thing that we're looking for as evolutionary biologists. And maybe actually the reason we've been so reticent to consider that same-sex sexual behavior is a natural state is because of social biases and not actually biological rigor. And I'm not sure about any of the identities of those scientists who published that paper, but I think that kind of thinking of bringing queer studies and feminist studies to science is so key if we want to actually be doing good and rigorous science and challenging the kind of biases that we've been talking about with like how the Western Academy works.
Excellent stuff. Scott, yeah, jump right in.
Yeah, no, I just want to follow on. I want to follow on from what Anita said, because I think one role that that queer scientists can play is interpreting some of the data, some of the studies that come out like that. You remember the gay gene, you know, and other kind of mechanistic explanations or evolutionary explanations for you know, sexual orientations and gender identity. So we're in a unique position where we can kind of interpret that for the queer community. I think that's really important. And yeah, I just think, you know, back to what we were talking about, like challenging heteronormative standards, like in academia, it's like, well, sharing experiences is so important. Visibility is so important. I keep, you know, rainbow flag in my office. I don't teach, but I have students that work for me. And I just think it's important, you know, I have a picture of my husband up in my office, and it's just really important to represent and to let people know, like, if they're coming into your space, it's a safe zone, you know, and just, I think a lot of minorities, like, people who might be interested in entering a scientific, becoming a scientist, may not see people like themselves, right? And so it's important for all of us to represent and be that, so people can see that, we're scientists too.
Yeah, I'll also plus one kind of the general, just sort of like by doing what we do and being who we are, like that's enough. I really don't think that like anybody has an obligation just like because you're part of an identity to like be front and center of like inclusion efforts, as I think it's well-meaning when people are kind of like, okay, we're doing some diversity and inclusion stuff, like please come be our representative or whatever. But like obviously that can lead to then this like disproportionate amount of extra work that you're doing that you're not really getting credit for, because it's not necessarily seen as having the same currency as whatever your primary work is. So I definitely want to plus one that. But yeah, also like just to give some specific examples of how sort of like perspective and knowledge of queerness like can inform science. So like in my field, for example, in human computer interaction, as with many human subject studies, including medical and psychological and so on, it's very, very common to ask identity questions about your subjects. And like for a long time, the norm has just been binary, male, female, gender, like not, kind of not making any distinction that might be relevant to trans people, not explaining kind of what they're going to do, like what they need that data for, what they mean by it, and like, so that leads to these kinds of results where sometimes they'll say, oh, there was a significant difference in like male and female patients or male and female subjects for, a particular piece of software we studied. And in some cases, this isn't really a big deal, other than it's just sort of like, well, okay, then, or you might be missing some data. But in other cases, like for example, when trying to assess your risk for something like heart disease or COVID-19, if these results are reported according to binary gender, then like trans people and non-binary people don't necessarily know like which factors went into those results and like how to reason about their own safety. So just having more scientists on teams that can help structure those studies and interpret those results, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense to me. Thanks. So let's see, looking at the clock, we're at 12:45. We've got lots of program left, everybody. I want to remind folks that you can drop questions for our panelists in the chat on YouTube or on Facebook, if that's where you happen to be watching as well. We're going to get to those. I'm going to get to those here in just a moment. Ray, a question for you. What do you feel like are some of the common preconceived notions that you've encountered within the scientific community? Like if we were going to debunk some flim flam, where would we go?
Oh geez, I wasn't ready for this. No. Where to even start? So are you talking more of like the science side or more of like the social side, or both?
Let's start with the that's a very good question too. I guess, but I'm interested in having the career in science and being in that space, and then coming up against preconceived ideas or notions.
Okay. Yeah, I can talk about one that comes to mind immediately. So kind of a preconceived notion or like idea that you encounter in science, and especially going through academia, is the expectation like, oh, you come in, do a project when you're a PhD student, and then you proceed to do a postdoc on like in a whole nother place on a whole nother topic, so you can get like your diversity experience, and then you become a professor. And I think that's kind of like what the system currently says. It's like, oh, that's success in academia, is to like be a professor and to do like research that is like meritable and is like completely objective. But when all of that is complete flim flam, because to me that doesn't make sense to to hop from project to project that isn't like relevant to me or to like the communities that I'm a part of. And also like coming into academia, I've been very blatant in like not wanting to be a professor and more wanting to do something like in direct connection with my tribe and to work with like a non-human relative in a way that's more socially acceptable to my peers, instead of like some random exotic organism that exists. Because I think that all is very much linked to like colonialism or settler colonialism, the idea like that, oh, I can hop over to Australia and do research on an organism and have no cultural ties and social ties to the people that live there, take my information, run back and publish a paper. So I'm very much trying to like break and get rid of like that flim flam and talk about it more and more often as much as I can. So like I'm very open about like not really wanting to go into academia now and like doing research that is like relevant to me and my people. Does that kind of answer the question?
That's a brilliant answer. But it does raise the question for me, if these paths are so well laid, how much more challenging is it then to be intentional about jumping off the path? Or is there something that makes it simpler where it's like open and honest communication? This is who I am and what I'm doing.
It's overwhelmingly it's overwhelming like how much pressure there is to stay on this path. Throughout high school and undergrad and graduate school, I've had so many people tell me like, oh, you don't need to like go back to your community, it's fine, like you can help them in other ways, like you can like make or get a job, make money, and then like give back to them or start a scholarship or something. But to me that feels so detached. And so even though I've been very vocal about like what I want to do, there are so many people and little cuts all over the place. Like death by 1,000 cuts is what it feels like, of people trying to push me down this specific path that they see is the right path, when right and wrong is very much a binary that is very subjective.
Wow. Thank you.
Sorry, that was a lot.
No, I mean, that's brilliant. And it's great insight into how everyone in the scientific community, really everyone, right? We talk about these things in terms of like science careers and STEM, but it's really community and society at large, how we all have to be, we all have to change the way that we think about these things in order to make space, right, for everyone in the paths that they want to choose and the paths that they want to take. All right, let's see here. Okay, I'm checking the clock. Okay, we're at 10 minutes left in the program, so I want to do audience Q&A. Before I jump into that, panelists, if there's something that you'd like to say or express that I didn't ask, or you feel like is kind of hanging out, wave, let me know, because I want to bring you on and give you the opportunity. Anita, you're up first.
I just wanted to jump in with another preconceived notion.
Yes.
That I think has come from conversation with friends and really well-meaning folks in my department. So I think it might be just a helpful thing to kind of like debunk for, like fellow scientists who want to be allies. I think something that I often struggle with in those contexts is folks trying to use biologization as validation, as in like, oh, well, you can't help who you are and there's a biological basis to who or whatever is going on here, so therefore it's okay. Or like, you're just like me, we're 99 point whatever the same DNA, we all want the same kind of picket fence life, but you're just swapping out your partner with someone who's not what my partner would look like, or something like that. And yeah, I don't know, that's just something I've noticed a little bit in my department. And I think it's important to say like what I'm doing and who I am is not actually more valid based on whether I did or didn't choose it. I'm not convinced that I can't help who I am. And if I could, I think I would probably still pick this life because I like it a lot. And yeah, I don't know, I'm not actually looking to do exactly what kind of like the heteronormative boxes or whatever that we've been talking about would suggest I do, but just with a couple things tweaked. I think that's a lot of what my like identity as a non-binary person is about, is that it's not just like I'm almost the same, but just a little different. It's that I'm rejecting kind of the two box options completely. And so that's something I want to throw out. I think a lot of times when folks are trying to use biology and biological language to support queer folks, it comes from a really good-hearted place, but I think it might have unintended consequences. So I wanted to speak a little bit to that.
Thank you. And it looks like it resonated with folks, the other panelists too, who are nodding along with what you were saying. Excellent, excellent stuff. Anything else from anyone before I move on to some of our questions? All right, I've got some really good questions for you. First one that I'm going to throw your way is on YouTube from Nick, who writes, one thing that has come up in previous panels, this is the third panel we've done like this, is the importance of finding mentors in your field. Were you able to find mentors along the way? And are you mentoring younger LGBTQ plus scientists now? I was about to say, Dr. Chris, you run a lab at NC State, so I'm interested to get your
thoughts. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about mentorship. I think one of the most important things that I kind of had to learn as I was trying to like build my own sort of, well, like as I was trying to find mentorship when I was earlier in my career, and I mean, still obviously like you kind of need mentorship throughout your entire career, it turns out. But one of the things that was important for me to learn was that, you know, like if you're unlikely to find one person who's going to, like, mentorship means a lot of things, right? It means someone who can give you honest feedback on your work. It means someone who can listen to like your emotional crises when those happen. It means someone who can like relate to where you are and help you like figure out how to get to where you want to be. And it's like not very likely, especially if you are, you know, at an intersection that's not very common in terms of identities. Like you're probably not going to find one person who can be all of those things. So it's been really helpful for me to think about, okay, what are my actual needs and who are the individuals that I feel can meet each of those needs? You know, and I've been lucky enough to find some people that can meet several of those needs at once, who are both like wonderful, you know, friends or chosen family members who also get my research and can talk to me about nerd stuff. Those are like gems. They're the best people, but they're very few and far between. And yeah, and then I think in terms of like now, and I very much believe in, you know, sort of trying to not necessarily be all of those things, of course, but to like try to be the, you know, try to be a good mentor to the students in my lab for whatever, like in whatever role they want me to be that, right? For the most part, that's just advice about research and doing the science, right? It's not necessarily like we're going to become best friends. That's okay. But because I'm sort of public about my identity, you know, I do find that more people are kind of drawn to my lab just because generally like they know that they're probably not going to be like misgendered by their supervisor, right? Like that's something that is just kind of a basic quality of life thing that that I think people will be drawn to if that's available. So that's part of what I find important.
Excellent, excellent stuff. Ray and then Scott.
Yeah, the type of mentorship that I wanted to touch on and its influence in me is kind of like flipping it upside down from what people usually expect, which is like I'm mentored by somebody more senior than me, and then I mentor somebody junior to me. In regards to like my seniors and like PIs and stuff, I actually find myself doing a lot more like up-down mentoring to them, especially because I come from like this interdisciplinary work that I've done like in undergraduate and here. So in science and society, and talking about science communication and science and technology studies. And it's so fascinating to me to talk to individuals who like know so much about their science and know so much about like, or don't know so much about like what it means to be queer and what it means to be like a racialized minority in academia. And so like it's something like I've grown more comfortable with, and trying to get them more comfortable with, of being like, oh no, like I'm also like your mentor in a weird way, and in a weird way, I guess, in a different way. But then also to talk about like kind of people who are junior to me, and like the amazing things that I have learned from them. One being like a cousin of mine from back home who's kind of been like a cultural mentor to me. She's taught to me about a bunch of different aspects that I haven't learned about, and is my go-to for questions. And then also science-wise, there's actually one of my mentors on the panel right now, who is Anita. So because of Anita, I've been able to learn so much. Anita has like exposed me to different resources that I would never have come across. And we've had great discussions where she's taught me so much about like what it means to be like queer in STEM, and like about ecology and what it's like to be working in these different fields. So it's like I would not be here, and I would not be who I am today if it wasn't for these individuals and Anita. So
Don't make me cry on this Zoom, Ray.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. You know, I'm thinking about this, and you know, 4 of our 5 panelists here are pretty specifically in academic settings right now. Ellie, you're in a professional setting. So I'm curious about your insight on this idea of mentoring and finding mentorship as you've moved into sort of out of school and graduating, and then into this professional space.
And Chris, I think Scott had something to say as well.
He did, and I ignored it. Thank you, Anita. Ellie, I will come back. Scott, my apologies.
Yeah, no, thanks. Just really quickly, I just wanted to say, I remember what the person asking the question was referring to for previous years' panels, and I guess I could say, just speaking about that mentor relationship, where if you're going to go into, if you're going to enter graduate school, you do want to pick your advisor, your mentor wisely, right? And you want to, pick your school wisely, because it's still lots of states in this country that don't have legal protection for LGBT people in terms of housing and employment, right? So just make sure, just because the department that you're considering applying to for grad school is, really good in the field, right? That really well known in the field you want to go into, you want to be sure that you're going to be in a safe environment too. So just sort of do your research and look into it. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Now, thanks, Ellie, for holding for me.
Of course. Yeah, so I think Chris said a really important, they made a really important note that like you can't get everything you need from one person. And your manager in industry is not necessarily going to be your mentor. They're going to potentially review your work. They're going to make sure that your timesheet is right. They're going to approve like your PTO and things, but they may not be there to teach you. And depending on their management style, you know what I mean? They may not, they may give you a project and say, figure it out. And I think, Ray talked about self-advocacy earlier, and particularly in changing career paths. And I think that is also hugely important in terms of mentoring. Saying what you need and being able to like practice that bravery and saying, this is what I need, I'm not getting it, and all those things. And then sort of the reverse mentoring that Ray also mentioned, that's definitely been a thing. In my work group, we've held these sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion presentations sort of that are, they're pretty mild, and they're not necessarily maybe as deep or as serious as we want to get, but it is bringing, because there are so many different generations in the workforce now, it is definitely bringing these different ideas you know, about BLM, about the LGBTQ community, to our managers and our supervisors. I was talking to someone in my working group that's a little bit older, and they didn't know what imposter syndrome was. And that was a reality check for me, because I just thought that was so like in the like global lexicon, and it was just explaining, you know, I think our generation in particular is really more self-aware, more in tune, more willing to talk about our trauma, more into therapy, understanding like all of our crunchy bits. And so I think, you know, the reverse mentoring is really big in professional industry too.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Excellent. Also, Ellie, I'll let you know that you've got some fans in the chat who are saying, "Yay, geologists!" And then somebody also liked your sea urchin Pokemon, Ray. Just so there's love for everybody here, and that actually gets me into some questions that came up actually about the science. Tommy wants to hear from Scott to get a snapshot of globally present lichens and endemic lichens.
Oh, wow. Hey, I wasn't prepared for that. It's interesting. I think, I mean, so we look at, this is talking about kind of the pattern of evolution of lichen-forming fungi. And yeah, so endemic lichens would be lichen species that are found only in one place in the world, just unique to that area. And then, you know, the opposite of that would be these sort of widespread lichen species. And molecular methods, looking at the DNA sequence and reconstructing the evolutionary history of lichen fungi, has revealed that you have both. So you have some lichen species that look like they're pretty widespread, and the DNA sequences bear that out. But then, and there's different stories behind that biogeographically. Some of these, but then in other cases, you do have unique species in only one part of the world. And so I'm doing lichen flora of Bermuda, and it's a very remote, actually North Carolina, Cape Fear is the closest mainland to Bermuda. And so I'm actually doing some molecular work now to kind of see which of those lichens are actually unique to Bermuda, because we thought a couple were, but then they've been found in other parts of the world. But are they really the same thing? Sometimes things converge on the same phenotype. They converge on the same, you know, they look the same, but they're actually very different. So yeah, so I'm working on that question for Bermuda lichens.
Yeah, definitely gonna have to have you back to learn more about this science. And then another one that came in for you, Dr. Martens. This person is curious about the occurrence of games for supporting education, something more than online simulators.
Yeah, there's certainly a very large field of research in the application of games for education. It's not exactly my focus, but some of my work touches on that due to just general like kind of interest in cognition and like what's happening, you know, with like in players' minds as they play through like a puzzle game and sort of learn by doing what the mechanics of the game are without necessarily getting explicit instructions. I think there's like a lot of really exciting potential in games for kind of engaging us in nonverbal ways that like we're not necessarily that are going to just like much more rapidly get somebody up to speed with a particular skill or a way of thinking that, you know, reading something analogous in plain text wouldn't. There's a lot of research in this area, specifically actually perhaps of relevance to this crowd for like learning how biological systems work, for, you know, kind of creating models and simulations. I think as the questioner pointed out, there are, you know, online simulations of things where you can tune parameters and kind of see how it affects the differences in things. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd be happy to, I feel like this is like such a big question because there are so many, obviously, like every possible subject matter, there could be, you know, a whole field of research related to teaching that thing and perhaps game-based approaches to doing it. But I think it kind of has to be sort of like computer scientists really like to sort of make things as general as possible. Like, oh, this is going to be a game for like teaching everything in science, right? But like it's actually usually much more fruitful to think of a very, very particular domain, like go really, really narrow and think about and like kind of hear from domain experts about the very specific ways that thing works and kind of how, you know, like pedagogical approaches to it. So like, I don't know, teaching somebody how to like analyze a poem or something would probably look, you know, is going to require a very, very different kind of pedagogical and technological framework from like teaching somebody how, you know, what happens if like a new species of lichen is introduced into an ecology. And so like, yeah, that's kind of, it's a big subject. I'd be happy to follow up with like, if you have more specific questions about it.
Definitely a lichen video game. Well, everybody, how about wherever you're at, a great big round of applause for the members of our LGBTQ plus leaders in STEM panel today. I had a fantastic time learning and hearing from you. And I guarantee from looking at the chat, I think everybody else did too. We had a great program. There are questions in here that looking at the clock, I'm like, there's no way that we could get to all of these. We could probably do this for hours. And maybe one day we will. But for today, I think I'm going to go ahead and call time on our program since we are over. Everybody, drop your appreciations for our panelists into the chat. Make sure that you visit naturalsciences.org. If you look on the events calendar for today, you can see information, short bios for each of these panelists, as well as how to follow along with their work, whether they're on Twitter or other social media. It's all right there at naturalsciences.org on the event page for this. So I hope that everybody gets the opportunity to do that. Of course, you can always follow the museum as well for more great science and nature content. We're at Natural Sciences on all major platforms. And you can follow the Office of Environmental Education. They're on Twitter at North Carolina EE, and their website is eenorthcarolina.org. Anita, Ray, Scott, Chris, Ellie, thank you so very much for being with us today and chatting with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
So much.
Take care, stay safe, and keep your community safe. We'll see you again next time. Bye, everybody.